Okay, welcome everyone to today's webinar on land ownership and housing affordability. This webinar is a joint initiative of the Urban Governance Research Network and the Geodata for Real Estate Research Group of the University of Avignon. UGoveRN, the Urban Governance Research Network, is an international academic network, and we have the mission to generate and disseminate and also support interdisciplinary urban governance research. UGoveRN members unite around 4 different interrelated research themes, and notably property markets and spatial regulations are important as themes for today's session. The Geodata for Real Estate Research Group brings together a team of researchers based in Avignon who specialize in more quantitative approaches to land and property markets. And part of their mission is also to address challenges faced by local and regional authorities by understanding social and economic and environmental changes that are associated with residential dynamics. In May this year, we are actually organizing an in-person symposium, and the idea is to have a deeper knowledge exchange and also to establish future collaborations. And this webinar really serves as a mental exercise to stimulate our thinking about our research and to start brainstorming how we can use these different perspectives and methods to really understand the governance of land, property ownership, and real estate. So for today, we have asked 4 groups of researchers to share their insights and reflections on a specific question. And that question is, to what extent do different forms of land ownership impact housing affordability? Each presentation will be limited to 5 minutes, so it's very short, and we will follow this with the discussion. We have a very large group, so we will skip the more detailed introductions, but of course, all the presenters can introduce themselves at the start. The chat is open for questions, so the audience is welcome to also include questions during the presentations, and then we can pick them up during the joint discussion. So I would like to start by inviting Thibault and Pierre for the first one.
Thank you very much. To start the presentation, I'm Thibault Lecourt. I'm a PhD student at Avignon University, and I work on municipal land privatization in France.
I'm Pierre Lebrun, so a PhD candidate in Avignon as well, and I'm working on the geography of private property development in France. So in France, the problem of housing and affordability is mainly concentrated in the more dense urban areas. There is no price limits imposed on the housing. There is no or very few rent control. So the creation of affordable housing in France is essentially based on the production of new homes. In the absence of public regulation, what our research shows is that the production of new homes in dense urban areas tends to be monopolized by private developers. But the competition between developers to access to buildable land would lead them to increase the sale price of their dwellings and then producing unaffordable housing.
So in this context, our main topic is to understand what are the instruments to regulate land ownership in order to produce affordable housing. In France, housing production is primarily the responsibility of local authorities or their affiliated organizations. Planning control used to be a state prerogative, but it has been transferred to the local level nearly in the 70s in the context of decentralization policies. The state still establishes a kind of framework that includes social housing quotas, limits on artificial development, construction quality. The state also organizes place-based policies such as tax schemes for rental investment, but municipalities then really take action within this framework to produce housing using 3 types of instruments.
So the first one of those instruments, so it's the middle part of the graph on the right-hand side. The first one is regulating and taxing land use. The main instruments in this category are the local urban development plans and their possible extensions. This tool applies to all housing developments in a given municipality. My research suggests that their effect is very ambiguous and dependent on the strategical orientation of local policies. So they can exacerbate housing unaffordability, or they can limit it for the social housing associations. Second tool, the development zones. So this is supposed to be something quite French. Local authorities can create areas where land ownership is restructured in order to allow for major developments. In those zones, development can be delegated to private or to public developers. And the decision to do one or the other generally depends on the degree of fragmentation of local land ownership. My research suggests that this type of instrument does indeed limit the selling price of new homes by private property developers to an extent that can vary from one city to another.
And the third tool that can be used is public land development. Local authorities can make land reserves in order to produce housing and play a role to better control the location and the objectives of the programs. This strategy can be implemented within a perimeter. And in this case, we are at the intersection between the red Pierre just told and the blue I'm talking about. That is to say, development zones, but owned by public land owners. And this strategy can also be implemented by a more diffuse basis, guided by acquisition opportunities. My work suggests that public land ownership is a crucial factor in the production of social housing.
So just as a conclusion, what we show is that in the French context of decentralization of urban planning powers, the effectiveness of affordable housing policies will largely depend on the choice of planning instruments by the local policymakers. So the three tools that we distinguish. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So building a bit, I think actually off the previous presentation, my name is Andre Lagarza, and I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam, and I'm presenting some of the work that I completed with under the supervision of Tuna Tassan-Koch. And what I am sort of interested in looking at today is in a similar way, what tools do local policymakers or planners have to shape, stimulate investment and development within the city, especially when it comes to affordable housing production. But at the same time, is the planner's focus in the right place? So within a recent article that I worked on that's under review for an academic journal at the moment, I sort of established different types of regulatory interventions that urban planners might have by focusing on tax-based instruments that they could levy on a local level, fee-based instruments, which are a bit different than tax-based, but they're generally levied only once on a specific project or development, and also land-based instruments, which are the tools that include public land ownership, or like the CLTs, where they have different tools to sort of intervene within property markets. And what I did is I created a categorization of different types of instruments within planning systems within the United States, and how these in return sort of affect capital flows and patterns of land ownership. However, in doing so, my research really took me to look at all of these different multi-level regulatory landscapes that actually affect real estate and development investment, especially affordable housing production within the US context. So as opposed to only these local instruments that are the tax, fee, and land-based instruments, I saw many different levels of regulation that you could see on the left-hand side affecting affordable housing production and investment and capital flows more generally within cities. And within this, my argument within the specific paper was to think about the planner more as a central regulator that could shape different types of regulation across different multi-levels of public policy that sort of shape the outcomes. So as opposed to exclusively designing tax, fee, and land-based instruments on the local level, I pushed and I called for planning scholars to focus on understanding the multi-level regulatory landscapes that actually affect affordable housing production and investment. So when you look at the US regulatory system, there's a lot of federal funding that affects spatial outcomes within the built environment, but at the same time, there's state and regional funding that influences these same outcomes. So as a planner, we should work to better understand these wide range of regulatory landscapes that affect spatial outcomes. Within this, it was a bit of a critique, maybe in a different way than the French team just critiqued the local policy instruments that we have as planners, but in a way they're located in specific geographies, and at the same time, they are fixed within specific moments of time. So when we look at all these tax, fee, and land-based instruments, they have their limits. And in a way, if we want to surpass these limits and look at different regulatory interventions that these instruments don't provide, I think we have to look at how different levels of regulations affect spatial outcomes. So with this, it's sort of tying these instruments to affordable housing outcomes through sort of their effects on capital preferences and patterns of land ownership, but at the same time saying that these might not be enough if we aim to really produce more affordable cities. So with that, that's my presentation. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Andre. Next up, Remy, Laura, and Antoine.
So yes, so I will start again. So thank you. I am Remy Millet. I am a spatial economist. I hold a PhD. I defended my PhD in May 2023, and I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at Avignon University. So I would like to present to you a paper that we worked jointly on with Laure Casanova-Hainaut and Antoine Péris. That specifically assess the impact of purchaser category on housing markets. So our main question is whether or not homeowners are likely to impact local housing markets, as they are mostly considered as winners or losers of housing market dynamics. But we would like to assess the impact on housing markets. So we adopt a purchaser category that use the portfolio size based on the number of units owned by each purchaser, from 0 to more than 5 units. And the second thing is that we consider the delta in the number of owned properties after and prior to the purchase, to have a proxy for the financial constraints of each purchaser. So our objective first is to assess a difference in purchase price for each category for similar housing units. So we face a methodological challenge to have similar units. So we use spatial econometrics to model and to have a specific difference between a purchaser category. So we use what we call a repeat sales models to introduce a housing fixed effect. And under this condition, we can assume that the purchaser category capture most of the difference in the price effect. So when we look at the results, we have surprising results for the first thing, because when we compare different price, when we compare the price paid by first owners in comparison to purchasers that make a residential mobility, we estimate a purchase price difference by 8%, which is quite huge when we talk about transition to home ownership, to difficulty to access home ownership. But when we compare purchase price for similar housing units, we have strong differences. And the second thing is that we also find difference with small investors or big investors which is a purchaser that have at least 2 housing in the portfolio, and that had another one to the portfolio. So we have a strong difference by 6 and 3%. So it is the first step of our work, because we would like now to assess whether or not these price premiums based on purchaser category have a spatial contagion on housing markets locally, and determine in which condition the spatial contagion might happen. So that's the first part of our work. And the second one is to link this difference in purchase price to the structure of home ownership, which is the maps on the right in Bordeaux Métropole, to discuss specifically which category of purchaser might affect the local housing market the most. So that currently the objective of this paper.
Thanks a lot. And last but not least, Nakwa.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nagwa. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Amsterdam. And today I'll be sharing with you some work that we've been doing, myself, Sarah, and Professor Tuna. We're working on a paper where we are basically looking at the regulatory environment and especially regulations at different levels and how they're shaping property development, but also affordable housing production in Amsterdam. So Amsterdam is quite unique in the sense that it owns most of the land, but also 80% of this land, around 80% of this land is what they own, but most of this land is already developed, and so it's leased out to the private sector. And as many large European cities, there's a huge struggle with the housing crisis, and there's a shortage of housing. So in 2023, the Dutch government, they issued a statement with the ambition to build around 917,000 new homes by 2023, but it has to do so while achieving other targets such as the climate target. So in our research, what we did is we looked at around 150 regulations, all at national, provincial, and municipal level. We also conducted interviews with property and municipal actors to understand the complexities in implementing these regulations. And especially in recent years, we've seen an increase in a number of regulations, and these regulations are contradicting each other according to the interviews, and this was highlighted both by municipal actors and property actors. And this can be attributed by how the regulations are framed at different levels. So a study conducted already by Professor Tuna and Sarah, they show that, for example, national level regulations are focused more on regulating or controlling the market, whereas at a local level, they're much more broad and they're setting up a broad context for market activities. Sorry. At a local level as well, there's been the Dutch government has given a high level of control to municipalities to develop and implement their own spatial policies and strategies, and these are often non-binding and broad, and so it has resulted in a lot of flexibility and negotiation between public and private actors, but it has also fostered close collaboration between them, and this is to help the municipality achieve their targets. And from a national government, from a national level, the government has been also issuing regulation to meet their own targets. So an example is the Purchase Protection Act, and this law basically blocks investors from buying up affordable housing in the city. And this regulation is actually a response to a previous or another regulation called the Crisis and Recovery Act that was issued in 2010, which aimed to speed up decision-making processes and to develop faster. So basically, what we're trying to say in this paper is that the contradictions between regulations are impacting how the municipalities can negotiate housing targets. And so enabling affordable housing is really based on tools such as contractual agreements and negotiations between public and private actors. But more importantly, since the national regulations are the ones that are binding, future regulations need to take into consider land ownership dynamics to ensure affordable housing. Thank you.
I'm going to moderate some discussion, so I will simply jump into wrap up what we put on the table. Thank you, everyone. My name is Tuna Taşankok, Professor of Urban Governance and Planning at University of Amsterdam. I think we have a very interesting collection here. We are, in very different ways, we are mapping the multi-scale decision-making and regulation mechanisms and organizational structures that influence the affordable housing production. At the same time, we are also looking at the very diverse and very dynamic market of housing production. So these two, of course, dynamics get together in order to control or create a certain affordable housing mechanism. What we can see from all these research, there are efforts, there are kind of three types of efforts to control, and that's mainly to control the market mechanisms. Controlling, the first one is to control the market dynamics in general. There are all kinds of different tools and regulations to have some impact on the behavior of the market. Secondly, controlling the prices. I think there are all these specific regulations that try to do. And there are all these efforts to control the behavior of the users in terms of buying, selling, and living in these properties. What we also see is a very fragmented governance landscape where efforts at the local and national government levels are very different and very diverse. So we have these very fragmented tools landscape trying to control a very fragmented market landscape. And hence, of course, these efforts together are limited. I have some questions, though, in order to create some connections between the quantitative work put on the housing market side to the regulation market. For example, when we are looking at the housing prices, I would like to understand, first of all, how do we define affordability? Because there are, of course, qualitative ways of defining affordable housing markets. But I would like to have a little discussion among the participants. What is our understanding of affordable housing production? Is it affordable units that we buy or sell? Is it affordable units that we rent? And those who make regulatory research, did you make any distinction between regulations that control the rental market or the buying market? I will just throw this general question maybe to the public and to be a bit more specific. Can I start with the housing prices side? Because that's the side I understand less myself. So maybe I should. The research on housing prices. Did you put efforts or do you see ways to understand the distinction between rental market or purchase market in your research?
Actually, on our side, we mainly worked on the housing prices, but there is No, actually, we also worked on rent because there is this distinction between the free market and the social housing market. So we're working on the two sides because there is a competition between how social housing and not social housing. So this is the first way we have to distinguish between the two possible effects.
And you do not, you don't look into the in-between market between the social housing and the market housing. Do you describe a certain range of affordable housing units? Because in Amsterdam, we have a very clear distinction between social housing, affordable housing, and luxury market housing.
No, but there is actually in France, we have a third category that emerges quite recently, which is the intermediary market. So it's something in between the social and the free market. We do not have data on that so far. So within the field of the rent housing, we have some data on the social part. So it's the work of Thibault. We have data on the free one, which is tu travailles un peu là-dessus ou pas? Non. Free rental market. No, okay. So, and on the free rental part, we do not have that much data as well. But then we have data on the housing sales. And this is mainly on so I'm basically only working on the sales by property developers. So indeed, there is like different levels of market that we are focusing on, which are quite difficult to compare. But how to define affordable housing on the private property market is quite a technical issue, but there are some work done recently by a research team in Paris, and Guillaume and Laure were part of it. They are studying the affordability based on a price to income ratio that can be calculated at the local scale or at the regional scale or at the national scale. So, and it can give different results. So it is possible to study how the housing market is unaffordable for the very local people, and also to see if someone who would try to move in would be able to do it based on the average income of the population.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Sarah and then Andre had comments.
Yeah, just tying in with what Pierre said, there was a research, I think in 2018, saying that purchased housing in Amsterdam is the most unaffordable in comparison to other European cities, because I think you needed at that point 22 times the average household income of people residing already in Amsterdam in order to purchase a new unit. So I think these kinds of approaches make it very context specific when you talk about affordable housing. It's very difficult to have a general understanding of it. And another point is that affordable housing, some people mix it up with social housing or public housing. Some mention middle income housing. So I think it's a good first step to always reflect on what we actually mean and which category we refer to.
Before going into Andre, I think it's a very interesting point that makes me think about research that we have been conducting. Basically, in order to understand the impact of regulations on the affordable housing market, we look at the investment market behavior. But in our research, we didn't look into different housing price categories and basically what this produces at the end. We have transition data, for example, but we don't know how these different categories of housing within the affordable housing market is being influenced by what type of regulations. So I'm putting this as an interesting potential gap to look into research, connecting the behavior into price categories. Andre.
Yeah, no, just reflecting on sort of Pierre's and then Sarah's comments. In the US, especially on the regulation side, you actually see a lot of regulation on the state and national level that stimulates affordable home ownership. However, at the same time, home ownership involves a mortgage, which is tied to the Fed funds rate, tied to 10-year treasuries. So we have other types of policies and other types of financial instruments that end up affecting the debt to income ratio and the payments that people make on their homes, right? And it doesn't adjust over time most times in the United States. So we have a wide range of instruments and different sort of regulations that affect the spatial outcomes and even the affordability of a home, where you as a planner might not have many tools to do it, or make homes more affordable, especially if this policy is within the space of more to buy rather than to rent. And I think we have some questions from the audience too, Tuna.
Yes, I saw that, but before going in there, of course, we had a very specific ambition here to initiate a discussion about the impact of public land ownership on this picture, because the assumption usually in research is that public land ownership gives power to governments or public authorities to control the market better. But recent research in Amsterdam also shows that especially the new policies of increasing the densification within the city of Amsterdam leads to losing green public spaces and increase of housing units. But it's not very clear whether these housing units are affordable housing units and how the prices are changing. Of course, we need to see the consequences within the couple of years' time. But the landscape is quite complex to understand these effects and influences. Let me look into the chat box to see some questions. I will start with David Evers. He's talking about United States. He's curious about the ideas about the French situation. Is this much more interventionist, as the stereotype would suggest? The same goes for the French team. He's asking, do you feel France goes far beyond the US, and how? So basically, whether the stereotype about the state's strong role is true, and how do you see the impact of it? Maybe Antoine, you wanna respond to that?
Yeah, I don't have a very precise view of the regulation in the United States. But regarding housing affordability, I would say that there is an important role of the state in fostering investment by households. So there are these tax incentives that are place-based policies. So there are regulations, but they have been criticized for, I would say, making the market more expensive. And there have been, in Bordeaux especially, some contagion of these housing programs toward the rest of the city. But yeah, Pierre also has some ideas about that, about the regulatory framework locally and nationally, and can maybe also talk a bit better about it than me.
Yeah, so I'm not very familiar with the American context neither, but indeed there is, I think, quite a strong interventionalism on the French side, and there is, I have in mind a recent publication from Berisha and some co-authors that validated the fact that France can be categorized as interventionist in terms of housing. And so, yeah, actually the work by Neil Brenner on the new state spaces applies quite well to France. So there is indeed this decentralization trend, but also the fact that through urban locational policies, the state maintained some quite strong control on the local regulation. So through national schemes, for example, and our work currently with Sarah, for example, is trying to shed some light on how the state is able still to orient the local dynamics of housing market in terms of affordability, actually. So.
Yeah, so maybe after all these stereotypes may not be correct. David Evers puts just this comment saying that the Amsterdam case is interesting, given the selling of leaseholds in recent times, the erfpacht. If public ownership, he says, or control is important for affordability, this move could hypothetically result in reducing affordability in Amsterdam. And I also believe that these efforts of controlling is going to certain directions, but I don't see direct control on the production of luxury units. So I'm very curious about how these efforts are going to land at the end. We have a couple of other questions. Anna Hag from University of Amsterdam asks, maybe the BRS in the French context could be interesting regarding an effort to make property more affordable. Any reactions on that, the French team? You agree? I see.
The BRS is a way to separate land from buildings, and there are initiatives that started really recently. Some programs started to be developed in most of them in the Paris region, but I don't think there is enough. There are a lot of research on them currently, especially in a research program about housing affordability led by the Union Sociale de l'Habitat, so kind of association of housing, social housing, and they are investing in them, and they will assess the impact, I think, very soon. But it's quite new.
Yes, obviously there is room for more research in several specific instruments, also in the case of Amsterdam. I see Lee Van from University of Cambridge asking on Amsterdam, any insights on the particular sequence of introducing the regulations? Were later policies intended to refine, rectify previous ones, effective? Any consolidation of existing policies, looking at the depth of policies might be helpful. Maybe Sarah, it's a question for you.
Yes, I love the formulation, the depth of policy. However, I think in the Amsterdam context, what we see more is just a piling up of more and more policies. So of course, a few are disappearing, but the general trend is just to adding more and more to it. And that happens at all different levels. And that's why we also see a growing amount of contradictions and inconsistencies between all these regulations. Of course, from our perspective, a lot of the current regulations are trying to rectify the issues that past regulations created. So there was a time where at different levels, especially at the national level, the property markets were opened up, investors were invited, restrictions on investors were removed. And of course, that intensified the affordable housing issues in the city. And now, even from the national government, with housing becoming much more politicized, there is a bit of a turnaround, and more regulations are introduced that actually allow the municipalities to be more restrictive, to restrict who can buy houses, for instance. You have some requirements to live in the houses when you buy them. All of these things happened in line with political developments in the recent years. But I think still the main overview of our research is that if we look at all the valid regulations, each year over the last 25 years, we see a very steep increase. So we have basically a very interesting graph where we can see there's almost 3 times as many regulations currently valid compared to 10, 15 years ago.
Thank you, Sarah. I think it is closing time for this webinar, and I would like to first of all indicate that in a very short time, what we tried to do was to reflect on with our researchers a question: how different forms of land ownership impact housing affordability? And we try to show the forms of property, the different types of property market actors, connecting these different forms to property and prices, and then at the end to regulation. I think my conclusion from this very brief reflection is that we need more research in this topic. Of course, for that purpose, we are organizing a wider seminar, a symposium at the University of Avignon in France, in person. So we are, as the UGoveRN team members, planning to travel to France and meet in person and discuss these ideas further. And of course, hopefully share with the wider academic community our results. So we are going to share different findings, methods, especially the interdisciplinary methodological exchange that we will have, our mini excursion roundtables, and of course we will have lots of fun in France, I hope, and we will share with the UGoveRN community our results. Thanks everyone for your contributions, and really good to see you, those that I haven't seen in a while.